Hi, everyone, and welcome to this PRCA's Health event on adapting communications in a post-COVID world. I mean, I'm sure as you're sitting here in the midst of a second lockdown, the world is beyond lockdown is probably difficult to imagine. However, joining us today, we have some experts across media, content, and internal engagement who will be giving us their insights and experience the last 7 months and be able to help us sharpen our communications approaches across this evolving landscape. So we have Rob Martindill, who's the Executive Creative Director at Content is King. Content is King create videos, events, and documentaries and animation for brands and agencies. Since the pandemic hit, some of their projects have included an online documentary for IBM and Wimbledon, creating a viral campaign for AstraZeneca and Mischief to promote their childhood flu vaccination, and working with Sandoz to support some of their employee engagement. The team are currently also producing Asda's Christmas online campaign based around how they're supporting isolated customers. We've also got Emma Divers, who is Scotland's manager at PLMR. I believe she's also an exiled Scot down here in London at the moment. She provides public affairs, media, and reputation management for clients across health and social care, energy, and environment. And she's also recently been on PR Week's prestigious 30 Under 30 list. And finally, we've got Nicole Linger, who's Head of Employee and Experience and Change at Edelman. She advises organizations around change, internal and strategic communications, and employer branding. So what they're going to do is they've each taken a different facet of our experiences over lockdown, seeing how communications have adapted and how we might be able to use that sort of experience and insights into creating sharper and more targeted communications, both externally and internally. So first, we're going to hear from Rob, who's going to run through exactly how we can actually create better video content in a time where we're all moving online.
Yeah, Rob, thanks very much, Matt. First of all, I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a few slides lined up to take everyone through. And yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for joining us. So harnessing video in the COVID era. You know, as we all know, video has always been a powerful tool for conveying brand values, product benefits, etc. But I think what none of us probably suspected back in March was that video was going to largely replace face-to-face communication for the foreseeable future too. So for us as a video agency, you know, we immediately had to rethink not just how we could produce engaging and effective films for our clients under the restrictions as they were then, but also how we could help them to harness video in new ways to replace the avenues such as live events that they'd lost. So I'm going to spend my 15 minutes giving you kind of the top 5 insights that we've learned over this period of immense change alongside our clients and agency partners. So first of all, a nice reassuring one, you know, the same rules apply, okay, at least when it comes to briefing, developing, and commissioning video. You know, before considering what the style, format, and channel might be for a film or piece of comms, you know, we still have to ensure that we understand the problem that this piece of comms needs to solve. So, you know, commissioners, clients, and agencies that work with us as partners, you know, they need to provide a clear brief to the producers with clearly defined goals. And us as producers of the content, you know, we need to know who are the audience still, how can we reach them best, which channels do we need to use, and, you know, critically, what do you want them to think, feel, and do? And, you know, these questions are the same ones that we were asking pre-COVID. It's just that now the answers are different, basically. So once that's all understood, we can then come up with the right format and creative solution. And it might not always be what the client had envisaged at the start, and it might not always be, you know, using a format that has worked for them in the past. And I think that comes really from understanding the audience, which is absolutely key, and which leads us on to insight number 2. This is a bit sexier than the rules are still the same. This one, turn windows into doors. So what we mean by that is, you know, turning screens, you know, 2D kind of static screens into places of interaction and absorption, because, you know, video has replaced face-to-face interaction to an enormous extent, you know, for good and bad. And people's locations, the audience's locations, their frame of mind, the channels that they use daily, you know, have changed enormously. And, you can't just expect a video to replace an in-person experience. It's like, trying to replace a holiday with a week-long video of a beach and expecting that to have the same psychological benefits. So you have to harness your media channels and your formats, the best way you can without trying to replicate something that they can't do. So when it comes to the audiences, you're much more likely to crack a comms challenge if you understand your audience. And we have to throw out our assumptions because people's situations are completely different. So we have to take time now to understand them and their new situations. We need to talk to them. We need to draw on our own experiences of kind of working at home and this kind of hybrid domestic work experience that many of us are going through. And we need to track what's working. So paying special attention to analytics like drop-off and completion rates. We might be finding that what was working in the past isn't working anymore because people's attention spans are different and the distractions domestically when we're expecting them to absorb our messaging is different. And this has a really important impact on culture as well. Culture is, in terms of internal comms especially, culture is dissipating enormously due to that lack of kind of in-person attendance at work and being in person with our colleagues and stakeholders. So culture needs to be baked into all of our content and comms now that we're producing for clients. So that means, paying special attention to tone and branding. Screens are the portals now into culture and purpose. And even if, screens can't replicate the experience of sharing a physical space and that intangible kind of self-generated nature of culture that exists, video can still communicate the signifiers of culture. And when I say video now, I don't just mean, filmed and edited or animated content that's created from scratch. I'm including video calls and webinars in that as key communicators of culture, because we're all broadcasters now. Most professionals now have to communicate far more via video, and non-video producers are being asked to run webinars, recordings, events, social events, often using whatever resources people have at home. And all of these interactions are micro broadcasts in a sense, and they will succeed or fail in the same way that any broadcast succeeds or fails. So the first port of call of assistance when planning any sort of video comms should, ideally be in-house professionals or trusted agencies or suppliers. But, as we know, that's not always possible and may not be within budget or the time frame available. And we have had a lot of panicked clients come to us of late who've, tried to self-record a town hall or a webinar. And, various things, have unfortunately gone wrong, as they can do. There's a lot of moving parts to these sorts of communications, everything from, Wi-Fi issues. And we had a client who'd hooked an ex-chancellor onto a webinar, and basically it didn't have a good enough Wi-Fi connection, and they kept dropping off, and they kind of lost them as a contributor. And that, right through, the other issues can be, right through to poorly recorded audio and video, which we've all kind of experienced. And, production companies like us, we can do salvage jobs on that material potentially, but it's better to get it right at the time of recording. So getting the basics right is really important. Camera quality, lighting, framing, those technical elements. We've for our clients, we've shipped out plug and play USB mics and cameras similar to the ones I'm using now, which are just a level up on the usual built-in cams and mics. This is obviously when there's a bigger audience or a more important audience of stakeholders than just your colleagues, but adding consistency and quality to these sorts of addresses is really important, because we wouldn't accept, if we were in a meeting together with colleagues or key stakeholders or presenting, we wouldn't accept all being at different eye levels and having not being able to see each other's faces properly or hear each other properly. So why should we expect audiences to tolerate that now on video communications online? We have to improve it. And also that's also important when it comes to controlling structure and narrative and agendas. People rightly get Zoom fatigue and screen fatigue, because a lot of it is kind of unstructured rambling, and I hope I'm not hope I'm self-aware enough to avoid that pitfall on this call. There needs to be a firm editorial hand at the tiller when it comes to video communications, even if it is a Zoom call and a webinar, because audience attention will drop, it will fade. We have to fight hard to keep control of that. Also, the importance of good contributors on video. We need to cast our video communications more now, because you do need people with storytelling capabilities, with positive energy, and ideally a degree of charisma. It's not a great time for introverts and camera shy people who are being pushed in front of cameras and being asked to perform without training often. So put their skills to better use elsewhere, or train them, I'd say, and think carefully about who you're putting in front of a live audience and expecting to perform. And off the back of that, in general, all of these video comms, we do need to level up to stand out, because of that attention deficit that people have at home when consuming now, and all the distractions they have, and all of the competing things that there are for their attention. What viewers will accept live and in person, they won't accept on something that's been pre-recorded and has been packaged back to them. It's like the difference between attending an in-person day-long event and kind of enjoying the leisurely pace of it, but then being expected maybe to sit through a recording of that same event in real time. It doesn't work. You're never going to cling on to the audience's attention like that. So be aware that things have to be edited tighter. Things have to be jazzed up with extra visuals, motion graphics, infographics, extra branding, stings, music, all of the tools in filmmakers' toolbox to hold that attention, to communicate key messages tightly, have to be used. And that's when it comes to using webinar technology and live event technology. We mustn't at the same time discount the resources and techniques that are still available to us despite COVID. It is tougher to make videos the traditional way now, but we can still be inventive with the resources still available to us, using things such as green screen studios, which are still open and can function very safely, even during, and can, safely and legally even during lockdown. And we've used them, and they're great because you can take your contributors into that space, film them against the green screen. A client can join and direct and pitch in remotely, and see what's happening, and can help control the recording. We can take their scripted or unscripted contributions and then place that into a branded environment. Place more than one person in a shot. They might be on different continents, recording in different weeks. We've done this for our client Third Bridge recently. There's a still in the bottom left-hand of the corner there, and just add extra branded elements and extra motion graphics, etc., and have something that feels really rich and not produced kind of within lockdown, within those parameters. Similarly, in-person filming shouldn't be ruled out. You can still film in person. 2 days ago, I was filming for Asda on the aforementioned kind of Christmas campaign that we're producing for them, filming with their customers on the doorstep, safely, legally, with skeleton crews, and getting their authentic stories, and that will be edited together to create something that feels of today, of the time, but isn't confined to Zoom calls, and that kind of that format that is being called upon, maybe too much at the moment. So animation and archive are also really key resources that we can continue to use during lockdown. Animation, obviously, you can depict anything. You can depict crowds still. You can depict people touching each other and in close proximity in a way that we can't film at the moment. And archive footage can also fulfill that role, whether it's in-house, repurposing B-roll you've shot for previous projects, or using excellent stock footage. And there is a lot of great stock out there. We can't travel to shoot New York and LA from London at the moment, but we can use great stock that exists out there. So make sure that you have got good suppliers in those fields as well, and maybe create your own B-roll archive so that you can repurpose stuff that you've paid for and shot in the past as well. I'll come on now to the final insight, which is about embracing the unknown. Really, everyone was very, was rightly worried and concerned at the start of the pandemic, and they are now. No one truly knows how permanent these changes to our lives are going to be, and we can't assume things are going to return back to normal anytime soon. So we do need to be prepared to embrace new ways of doing things and stay on top of trends and developments. That means keep platforms, as we should be doing anyway as professionals, but things like 360-degree video and holographic video that have been trialed in recent years can really come into their own in the future as ways of placing people in the same kind of virtual space. Same for VR technology as well. That's obviously got a lot of potential for replacing larger scale events where we can place attendees in a virtual environment together and replicate some of the micro interactions that you would get at that kind of event, and the kind of networking that would happen as well. The return of collective experiences, even if it's something, is really important. Even if it's something as simple as a watch along that you can arrange online. So rather than distributing a film for people to watch in their own time, at their own leisure, you can schedule a premiere and have people attend a room online where there's a sense of anticipation. People can chat beforehand. Everyone watches the film at the same time, and everyone can then chat and respond live with each other, a collective experience. However we can bring those back, we've got to explore the best ways and new ways of doing it. So ultimately, it is the perfect time now to be bold and innovative with our comms and with our video comms. The pandemic has amplified our need for connection and accelerated the pace of technology that will get us there. And I think video will have an important role to play in that going forward. So that's it from me. Thanks very much. Just stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. That was really good. And as we were just saying in the chat, we are inviting questions and chats and comments to go along with these presentations. We will be doing a Q&A after all the presentations have finished, but feel free to get the conversation going in the chat box. We're now going to move on to Emma Divers, who is going to speak around the media landscape, particularly through COVID. So Emma, take it away.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to talk about reputation management and media engagement during the pandemic. I'm going to use a bit of a case study of a successful crisis management situation, which I think might help those of you who are beginning to prepare for that second wave. We'll look at how the crisis was navigated, the lessons learned, and how those might apply to your own work. I think one thing to say beforehand is that this might, just through the nature of the case study, be more relevant to those of you who are representing health and social care staff on the front line, but I do think that it also rings true for people who are dealing with, supply chains and other areas, because the rules of media engagement within a crisis are kind of universal. So I am going to start way back in early March, because I think by that time, everyone across the country was waking up to the fact that COVID wasn't going away. For my agency, PLMR, we have a specialist health and social care practice, and we represent over 800 care homes from the UK's biggest providers all the way down to little individual ones. And we had been watching the infection rate rise at the same time as those really awful images were coming in from Italy and Spain that was showing elderly people being taken out of care homes in body bags. And I distinctly remember us turning to the whole team and just thinking, my God, we need to get prepared. But bear in mind, at that time, the government was still assuring everyone that care providers could kind of carry on as normal. There was no need for PPE. It was a question of increasing your hand washing, increasing surface washing, don't let visitors in from Italy and Spain. So we were drafting these stock lines of reassurance, advising clients to reach out to stakeholders and relatives. And we had told them to start thinking about what they would do if the virus had entered their home. And then it was literally like overnight that everything changed. We had a single day where suddenly the virus had entered the homes of multiple clients. We had this massive outbreak in a home in Scotland, and I will never forget the conversation where the client told us that they were having difficulty ordering the thousands of extra body bags that they would need to account for their worst case scenario projections. And it was around about this time that we got the call from the case study provider that I'm going to talk to you about today. So this was a small not-for-profit care provider who we've worked with for years. And they contacted me to say that they needed some help managing their comms around COVID. In all honesty, I thought this was going to be a really easy brief. This provider is genuinely excellent. They have fantastic CQC results every year. They're on the ball. And in my almost 4 years on that account, I think I could probably count the amount of reputation management situations I've had to deal with for them on one hand. But it didn't really turn out that way. And by April, the virus had entered 2/3 of their homes and they had multiple deaths. They had one care home that over a 2-week period lost around 30 residents, which at the time made them the care home with the highest death toll in the UK. They were absolutely overwhelmed by distraught relatives. Their staff were terrified. Political stakeholders were accusing them from everything from gross mismanagement to negligence. And there was a frankly very aggressive media onslaught. On paper, this should have ruined their reputation, but through cohesive comms strategy, we got them through it. And they came out of it not only with a Pride of Britain mention, supportive stakeholders, and access to early testing, but that early testing ultimately saved lives. And that shows how important comms is during a crisis situation. So if we move on to the next slide, I can tell you how we managed that. Perfect. So the first thing that we did was we planned early. By early March, as we said, it was clear that the government didn't have care homes front of mind. So we looked to other countries that did. What were they doing successfully? Well, I mean, we all know it now. They had a robust testing system. They had access to PPE. This was the really important one. They had really clear government guidance. Now, the social care sector had none of this, but the industry bodies were all crying out for it. So we made sure that on behalf of this client, we asked for it too. Now, that wasn't to say that we could do a better job than organisations like Care England. Absolutely not. We weren't going to achieve cut-through where they weren't achieving the same thing. But it was really to build up that evidence base that we thought we might need later down the line, where we could say we asked, the local councillor, the MPs, the relevant ministers for the help that that care provider needed. At the same time, we were preparing a suite of comms for every single scenario. So what would happen if the virus entered the home? What would happen if there was a death? What would you do if there were multiple deaths? What were the protocols for communicating with internal and external stakeholders? We updated our media plans. We made sure that every single staff member, right from domestic all the way up to the CEO, knew exactly what to do and say if they got a media call. And that meant that when the crisis hit, every single person knew their role and knew what to do when the worst case scenario came. Controversially, and I promise I am not in the habit of making operational decisions or recommendations for clients, but we, in this case, made an exception, and we also advised them to shut their homes to non-essential visitors early. It was controversial because at the time, the government was still saying that care home visits should continue as normal. But we had one eye on other countries, and we also had one eye on all 4 nations in the United Kingdom. And we saw that Scottish Care was making sounds about closing care homes to visitors. Our knowledge of the sector basically told us that it was only a matter of time before England followed, and it might save some of their homes in the long run. ultimately that turns out to be exactly the right decision. And actually, because of the way that the virus spread in the community, when we look at the homes that didn't have the virus enter their homes, because they locked down early, we believe that they were able to handle that a little bit better. The second thing that we did was we logged absolutely everything. So that was every single letter that went out, every single staff training day, every hygiene poster that went up. We also logged every single time the government issued new advice. And for those of you who work in the NHS or in social care, you will know that over a few months, government advice on PPE was changing, up to a few times a day. I think overall around 50 updates were made. So that was quite a big undertaking for the staff. But what we were doing was basically building a timeline of activity that would ultimately play a central role in us defending the client to political stakeholders and the media later down the line. Basically, when the media came to us with accusations of gross negligence, saying staff weren't, trained in wearing their PPE, that the residents weren't socially distancing, that we weren't following guidance, we could point to the exact time and date the staff were trained, the specific guidance that they were following at the time. And our responses to the media were therefore so robust and evidence-based that we managed to kill several national stories from the likes of the BBC to the Sun and the Daily Mail just through that approach. For the stories that then did run, this approach combined with the fact that we asked for help early helped us switch the narrative away from a failing and negligent care home to let's think of these poor staff who have asked for help but didn't get it. And this proved crucial because as a result of that, we were building up local political advocates, and a local MP ultimately championed the case, intervened to get care home testing where they were previously refused. And that allowed this care home to test all of their residents, find asymptomatic spreads, put those residents who were asymptomatic in isolation, and ultimately helped manage the outbreak better and save lives. The third thing that we did, and this is key for no matter what sector you are in, is that we humanized the story. Journalists during COVID were desperate for a bad news story. They were painting this picture of a big bad care company that failed vulnerable residents, and they were forgetting that this big bad care company is made up of terrified staff members who are doing their best when the rest of the country is locked down. So from an early point, and despite us dealing with, I think, hundreds of inquiries a month, I made the point to speak to every single journalist on the phone to explain the specific situation at the home. I used the names of staff and residents. I told them the stories about how tired staff were, how scared they were. And most importantly, I was really firm in questioning whether a story that they were running, often based on anonymous sources, was really in the public interest, given the extreme anxiety it would cause for those residents who, let's not forget, they all sit around the TV and watch the 6 o'clock news every day. They get their morning newspapers. They're already old and frightened. Is it really worth it seeing their name in the headlines for unfounded accusations? And I found that this approach was really successful because it was likely to result in at least a delay to the story being run. So we then had time to either gather the evidence that we needed to rebut the accusations, or at least warn residents, relatives, and stakeholders that a story was about to break, which meant that we were the ones in control of that narrative. The final thing that we did that I think really helped was that we kept everyone up to date. I kind of took this really weird approach of it's better to annoy someone with too much information than kind of scare them with no information at all. We established a comms plan that meant political stakeholders, relatives, and staff received weekly updates on the homes in their patch. We didn't tell them too much because obviously in health and social care, confidentiality is absolutely vital, but we told them enough that they felt up to date. And this ended up being really important because one of the narratives that we've seen across the health and social care system during COVID, and increasingly actually as we're moving into that second wave, is that people are really scared when they don't have information. And they start thinking that there might be something underlying that there might be a bit of a cover-up, when in actuality, most organizations, they've just not thought to tell people what's going on. So that kind of approach really helped us to be able to point to the fact that we were keeping people up to date and there was no accusation of cover-up. So in the end, through that approach, we killed multiple national news stories. The provider weathered a storm that probably should have ended their reputation as we knew it. But they also cemented really important relationships with political stakeholders and with the media. And they now have this really good reputation across the sector as being a very caring and empathetic provider, which I think is important given the way that the narrative is slowly changing for care providers across the UK. That said, and if we move on to the next slide, I can talk through some of the things that we certainly learned from this crisis management situation and that we've been able to apply today as we're looking forward into this second wave. So one of the things that I would say first and foremost is that if you haven't started your preparations for the second wave now, you're already behind. You need to get started. Because I can tell you right now that this month, I have had probably more phone calls from clients than I had back in March about outbreaks within care homes, outbreaks within NHS facilities. It's ramping up. And yes, we know more about the virus, but the same questions are going to be asked of you now as they were then. So update your protocols now. Look back at any crisis situation or anything that went well or went wrong during the first wave. See what you've learned from it and apply those changes where you can. The second thing, and it's a little bit tricky to explain, but I'm basically saying that education about your sector before a crisis is better than education during a crisis. And I think it's best if I probably give you a little bit of an example on that. So one of the things that we found really tricky was that because journalism was so fast paced during the first wave, it was quite difficult to give the necessary explanations about a situation to a journalist over the phone and have them retain that information. One of the things that we found was, for example, care home staff were getting PPE, for example, at a care home. And then they were going home, watching the news and seeing the PPE that was given to an NHS staff member. Now, all of us working in health and social care, we know that the two things are not the same. There's different rules for different people. But they didn't necessarily understand that. And so they were then going and whistleblowing to the media who were calling up care homes saying, you're not following the rules. What is quite tricky in that situation is to very quickly explain why PPE is different in a care home to an NHS facility. So what I would say is really important is that you need to start thinking about how you explain difficult situations now and have your lines ready. So think about what you were asked during that first wave. Think about what you could be asked now as things have changed and get those lines ready so that they're ready to go and they are clear and they are concise and they are short, because journalists are time poor, especially during a crisis situation. The third thing that I would say is comms first and action second. And that obviously does not mean that you put out the comms before you've decided on an action. That would be insane. But it does mean that you put the comms out before you implement something or before something is announced elsewhere. Basically, what I'm saying is what you do not want to do is create that horrible vacuum between something happening and you announcing it, where people, whether that be your internal staff or external stakeholders and media, can start making up their own story about what's going on. It is much, much harder for you to control a narrative once the narrative is in the press and then change that than it is for you to seize control of that messaging at the very beginning. You seize control of the messaging at the beginning, you control how the story is put out, you control how people perceive that story, so long as you've done a good job with your comms plan. The next thing is that you need to know who your stakeholders are and you need to keep them updated. And I think I kind of covered this before, where I said that it was better for us to be annoying rather than absent. But believe me, it is much easier to explain away why you're spamming someone's inbox once a week than it is for you to explain why you haven't kept them updated at all. You need to find preferably a happy medium, but if you can't find that happy medium, just go for it, because the last thing you want is an accusation that you are lying by omission or that you are covering something up. And then the final thing, and I'll leave you on this point, is that it's also okay to push back against those rare times where journalists are inappropriate. And I will say that this is normally very rare. But what I did find, and colleagues found during the first wave, is that there were some sections of the media who were so desperate to hit that story of, you know, we have the worst outbreak in the UK at this particular facility, that they were willing to go way beyond what was appropriate. And I'm talking maybe breaking into care homes' back garden to take photos of residents through a window, or asking journalists to turn up at the door of a home manager who had just lost 20 residents. That's not appropriate. It's not in the public interest, and it's okay to say so. I think a lot of the time in the comms world, PR professionals get scared that if we push too hard against a journalist, that they might just run the story anyway, and then we've not done a good job for our organisation or our client. But believe me, if a journalist is willing to go to those lengths, they're probably going to run the story anyway. And it is your job to advocate for your client in that situation, to take that to another level, to complain if you need to. It's also okay to just treat these journalists like they're human beings and remember that they too are stressed, they are time poor, they're also dealing with really negative stories on a daily basis, and sometimes you just have to remind them that the people that they are dealing with are human beings just like them, and actually having that little bit of empathy can go a really long way in making them back down and start treating things with a little bit more balance. And I think that's probably the thought that I'm going to leave you on now. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Emma. Presentation skills worthy of Chris Whitty there. What we're going to do now is we've focused very much so far on external communications that move towards more digital and online, and being future facing in terms of how we're moving in terms of having our spokespeople on video. And then Emma's obviously kindly put us through the current crisis that we've seen in care homes and how the media landscape has been driving that agenda. I think they'll have quite a few questions on that later on. We're now going to flip into internal comms. Obviously, we're all working from home now. And one of the things that we discussed while putting this together was very much kind of how you manage to keep that sense of morale, identity, with the company that you're working with and the colleagues that you've got, as well as the fact that you're having to balance your home life with your professional life all in one place. So Nicole's going to come in here expertly and talk us through exactly what she's seen in the last 7 months.
Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction. So yeah, I'm Nicole Linger and I lead Edelman's employee experience and change work across EMEA with my team. And as you can imagine, we've experienced so much change over the last 8-9 months. And it's been an incredibly challenging, but also very interesting time. And we advise clients across all sorts of sectors. So we start understanding employee responses regardless of what sector you work in. But a lot of the work that we do is in the healthcare sector. So if I could just have the next slide, please. I'm going to be saying that quite a lot. But I'm going to spend the next few minutes sharing some of our observations and reflections from our work with clients. But regardless of where you in the audience work, whether you're working for an agency, whether you're working for a global healthcare company in pharmaceutical, we're all employees. You don't have to be a client advisor or even work in the communication industry to really get a sense of what's going on here now. Now, one thing I do want to give a nod to is that COVID-19, as we're all aware, has driven a shift towards more remote working. And many of us, and certainly in communications, are working from home. But I also want to be very mindful that so many workers out there are still on the front line. They're going into plants, they're in the labs. So we haven't forgotten about them. But the next few moments, I'm going to be really focusing on us, probably in the remote working category and probably working in our kitchens or our living rooms. So with the initial outbreak, if we think back to March, there was kind of a surge of energy, and both Rob and Emma have said, look, we didn't really know how this was going to go. It's still really uncertain, but employees were still really eager to stay connected and were getting engaged in activities virtually. But as time's gone on, things are a lot more indefinite, and we're all feeling the strain, whether it's the strain of looking after children, of managing the home, the lack of social life and no end to the workday. There is an increasing level of disengagement, and that is very different from when we started. And there's also, as you can see, a lot of mixed messages here. Now, I call this the data dichotomy. Feel free to take away what you want. But what is most interesting here is when we started, and I'm referring here to our Edelman Trust Barometer that we did back in March, and 90% of the people that we surveyed said they expect brands to protect employees, their health, their well-being, and their financial security. And I'm sure that's still the case. It's clearly been quite hard to do, but that's the case. But also, I draw your attention to the fact that now 72% of us workers would like to work remotely post-COVID-19, whenever that is. But at the same time, 75% say that they have faced some kind of burnout during this time and working remotely. So there's a lot of different things going on there and conflicting messages. So I'm quite confused by this, and I'm sure you're confused by it. So I'm hoping that over the next few slides, we can unpack this a little bit and just get some top line themes that are going on of what's working and what's not. Next slide, please, Kerry. So we're going to have a little bit of a session on lessons learned. And I think Rob mentioned it earlier. What worked back in March or April might not work now. Things that didn't work then could work now. It's all about evolution and constantly looking at what we're doing and keeping really curious and adaptable to what might suit our audiences. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it's really important to see the different perspectives so that you can, in the moment, adapt your approach. Next slide, please. So we're going to start off by looking at what's worked and what hasn't. Some of this can actually be seen as serendipity, because a lot of what has happened was actually on the agenda anyway. It's just been accelerated. So some of the digital approaches, the use of content, they were already in the works. Certainly ways of working, we've been talking about that for a while. But the good things that have come out of this, apart from the fact that a lot of us have learned that we can work virtually, it's an appreciation that this flexibility really can benefit us. And the thing that I'm really excited about is almost what I call presenteeism has been totally blown out of the water. That whole 9 to 5 culture, or 8 till 7 for a lot of us, management can no longer strangulate employee demands for flexible working. That is not acceptable anymore. And that's a really good thing. And the other real positive that's come out of here is there's been a reset in the role of the office. What is the office value proposition? And that is going to be different for the sector that you work in, for the organization that you work in, but we all have a responsibility to look at what the role is today and what it looks like in the future. Because many of us don't want to go into the office to have a meeting with ourselves. I don't want to have a meeting with myself in the office. So what do we use it for? What does it stand for? And we've all talked a little bit about culture, which is so important. How does that office drive our culture? And that is really on the agenda for certainly most of my clients and organizations that I'm talking to. The second positive that's come out of here is what we'll call leadership visibility. And I really want to focus on CEOs here as well. We've really seen a much greater connection between senior leadership, CEOs, and employees. There's a lot more two-way conversation. There's a lot more listening, workforce analytics, and almost the whole traditional model of senior leadership has been turned on its head. Why? Because CEOs are trying to answer the questions that they don't have the answers to. They have been grappling with the same thing all of us are, and it makes them a lot more humane and able to talk about it. So they have had a really challenging time in having to deliver their coherent long-term strategic view, but also create a set of effective short-term fixes for problems that they're not really sure how to solve. And a lot of them have been really honest about that, honest about the uncertainty, honest that they're not sure how this is going to turn out. And that has been really hard when you're supposed to be steering a ship. But they've been honest about it. We've seen a lot more humanity in their communications and certainly more empathy. And the other thing is around content. And again, when Rob talked about it, he talked about this user-generated content. What we're doing is seeing our CEOs at their kitchen table or in their living room using their iPhone to record a video. And that's really landed with employees because we've gone from this slick, scripted, talking head to my CEO really grappling with how to create a 2-minute video on an iPhone. And that's great. And we've loved that. Long may it live. Next slide, please, Kerry. This bucket is around innovation, empowerment, and agility. So we know we can now work collaboratively, and we've got great technology that can help us with this. And some of this is really new technology. And what struck me is how many organizations didn't have a channel to reach out in crisis at the same time to all their employees. We think that everyone has really, really advanced technology. So many are using email, and so many are only able to reach employees, a handful of employees through that email, and are relying on huddle notes. They're relying on posters, all sorts of outdated channels and approaches to contact their employees. So the good news is organizations have had to look at that and enlisted things like employee apps, Microsoft Teams, Workplace, all sorts of different new technology that should have actually come in a few years ago. So that's great. The other thing is we could argue that decision-making is quicker. There's been a reduction in bureaucracy, in process and procedures. Why? Because the boss that I had to get FaceTime with to gain approval is now much more accessible virtually, and their bosses too. And that has certainly speeded up some decision making and allowed for more face-to-face connection to present the business case. And then what else has worked? Big focus on health and well-being. Health and well-being has been on the agenda for a while, but the pandemic has certainly forced our employers to look at their employer value proposition and the deal they give their employees and their employer brand and what they're saying to the outside world about what they're giving them. And people demand health and well-being and safety, of course, in the workplace, or even when we're working virtually. So companies are taking multiple approaches to this. And, you know, there's tactical stuff like desktop yoga and nutritional advice, but it's also being really mindful of people's mental and physical health and ensuring that you're giving them micro breaks, ensuring that you're giving people time off to do their exercise if that's what helps their physical and mental well-being, and also being really respectful of how this pandemic is actually having an impact on us all, regardless of where you sit in an organization, because at senior leadership, almost junior level, no one is immune. Next slide, please. But there's plenty of stuff that hasn't worked. And we all love to be positive, but we need to be really mindful of what's going wrong. And things have really shifted over the past 8-9 months. And things that weren't challenges back then are challenges now that we as organizations or advisors need to understand. Burnout is real. I'm continuing on the theme of health and well-being, as you can see, but I'm flipping the coin. This is a real thing. Working from home means longer hours. We are logging on earlier, switching off later. And the delineation between being online and working online is a bit fuzzy. The strain of economic collapse, the fear of job losses, the fear of contracting COVID-19 or the health and well-being of my family, as well as I'm sitting here today, I've got a US election going on. We've got Brexit negotiations going on. All this is overwhelming, and it's creating burnout. You look at the hours, you look at the external environment, and then something else I'm discovering is people are actually taking less time off. And you're kind of, why? Well, it's kind of obvious that initially during lockdown, people didn't realize this was going to go on. So there was nowhere to travel. So people thought they'd shift their holiday to later in the year. But here we are again. And there's also the issue that people are actually scared to take time off because they're really concerned and fearful for the security of their jobs. So we have to be mindful of all this. And then moving to culture and social absenteeism. How do you build a culture or maintain a great culture when you are all working remotely? And in this, what I would call a depressing monotony, I'm sounding very negative, but a depressing monotony of every day and feeling that every day is the same because we don't have our social outlets, we don't have our external inspiration and all the activities that we used to do to break up the workday. And this means that people are disconnecting and that they haven't got time to engage with their corporate culture. They don't want to because they just can't cope with it. And it used to be visible in our physical infrastructure. Some of our offices were created and designed based on our company culture. We'd have posters, we'd have digital signage with our values. Now we don't have that. So organizations have to work so much harder to create that culture in the virtual world. There's ways we can do that, which I'll come on to. But I think the other thing that is eroding our culture, which we have to address, is we used to have those small interactions at the water cooler, those daily conversations which brought outside in thinking, different inspiration. conversations that build similarity, likability, conversations that build trust and camaraderie. All those behaviors build a culture, and we now rely on digital channels for that, and that's tough. Coupled with bringing new people into the business, whilst many of us have had hiring freezes, things are looking up again, and we're starting to bring people on. When we onboard people to an organization, it's really important that we're focusing on those little moments so they get to understand our culture. And we're really, really trying to embed them and have virtual tools that can do that. It's not easy. Next slide, please. Oh, this is the L&D struggle. And when I talk about learning and development, I don't just mean training. I mean those little moments, the moments in time or in the moment management, observations. You see someone doing something right when you're next to them and you celebrate it. You see something that could have been done better, you coach them through it. Those little moments have been lost. And somehow we need to find ways to bring that back. And while some organizations are deprioritizing traditional learning and development because they've got much in there, much bigger things to deal with as a result of the pandemic, others have actually prioritized it and they really want to invest in the development of their people. But then we have virtual saturation. And if we're delivering this training online, people don't want any more screen time. So we're grappling with that. And then finally, on the doom and gloom, reduce productivity and creativity. I mean, I mentioned those water cooler moments or those little breaks or chats in the office where you've got some inspiration. They're no longer there. And working remotely, especially if you're in something like research and development as well, if you're working with cross-functional teams, it makes creative thinking, innovation, and collaboration more difficult when you're not together. And there was an interesting survey in the scientific sector done by McKinsey recently with R&D leaders who predicted that 25 to 75% of their productivity had been reduced. And it was because of this. And they were seeing duplication of effort, lack of clarity and expectations, all those things, which had resulted in a reduction in productivity. Distraction is a real thing. I'm sure there's a number of you in the audience who are probably doing something now, emptying a dishwasher or, I don't know, feeding the cat. When we're working from home, distraction's like a real thing. Multitasking is real. As workers, we're all having to balance the demands of a home life and physically being there with the washing machine going in the background or the dog barking or a delivery arriving, with focus on our work, and it's tough. And the other thing that I personally struggle with, and I'm amazed my broadband has actually supported this conversation today, because I've had so many conversations recently and had to drop off because my Wi-Fi provider is not the greatest. There's hardware issues, lack of I don't know, technology failures, and they can all feel so much more intense and stressful when you don't have a team around you and you don't have your colleagues to help you. And that, again, is really having a negative impact on our productivity and certainly on our creative thinking and creating the headspace to come up with different ideas and inspirations. Okay. Employee comms for the uncertain future, and you'll notice a question mark here, and that's certainly intentional, because my expertise is in employee communications, but I'm not a fortune teller, I'm not a soothsayer, and I'm really not going to put my money on the future at the moment. But I have seen some trends, and can give you some recommendations based on those for your employee comms going forward. We've seen a lot of things work. And so I think it would be helpful, we felt, to share these with you, and you can take them away and have a think about if they'll work for you. So the first thing is saturation check. We talked about leadership visibility and lots of town halls, skip sessions, Q&As, but maybe there's just too much at the moment. And it was all novel, and now people are a little bit tired of it. If leaders have something to say, say it. So our recommendation is map your communication well. Think about what is working in the organization through listening to your employees, and create a leadership internal visibility program or plan that actually aligns with the needs of your employees rather than how it was a few months ago, and avoid that saturation. The second thing is around co-creating solutions. We've done some fantastic exercises around crowdsourcing, around employee listening, involving employees with co-creating new values, the new culture, the future of the office. Even when you're developing a new strategy for the future or repositioning a brand, and there's so much of that going on at the moment, involve employees, empower them, and make them feel a part of it. The third thing I would recommend is what I say, over-index on recognition. And when I talk about recognition, I mean manager-employee recognition, peer-to-peer recognition for good work. Have a platform for that, because we all need a lot of recognition right now. When we're working alone, it's very easy to ruminate on the things that just were perceptions rather than reality, you know, so make sure there's a recognition program. But when I talk about recognition, I'm also talking about recognition that people are in a difficult situation right now. You don't know what people are going through in their personal life. So whenever we have a check-in, it used to be about work. Make sure that now you can make it personal and just ask people how they are, what they're dealing with, and adapt around it, because many people are struggling. The fourth thing, which also links to our culture and our purpose, is connect as a community. Regardless of if we're in a physical infrastructure or virtual infrastructure, we really need to focus on creating a community. How you do that virtually is tougher, but it can be done. And the first stage is to really ensure that as an organization, there's a clearly defined purpose, employee story or narrative, and you really understand your employer brand, because employees really need to know that now. So when they are disconnected physically, they still feel that their job ladders up to your overall purpose, and all communications are underscored by your purpose, so people really know what they're working to beyond their day-to-day role. And we've talked about deploying new solutions, new content formats, new platforms for communication. It's really important now to embrace ingenuity and imagination, whether it's to build your community, whether it's connect around your purpose, storytelling, even celebrating great work done. There's loads of different platforms out there which employers have been really blinkered to, and now it's about bringing that outside in and finding new different social tools to really ensure that as an organization you are connecting with each other and feel as though you're a part of something bigger than just yourself sitting on your own in your kitchen. So my final mantra here, if we move to the next slide, is this: expect, respect, listen. So expect things are going to be amorphous for a while. It might be like this for years. We're all human beings, we're all employees. We will go through different emotional states at different times. So as a communicator, what we need to do is we need to do U-turns. We need to adapt. We need to flex where necessary, and really, really make sure that we are respecting how people are feeling at this time and what their needs are at this time, despite what's happening in the external environment. And finally, listen. We have to listen to how people are feeling, what they want from organizations, and make sure that we are responding and taking action that is really going to support them at this time. Thank you. I think it's over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Nicole. That was a really fascinating session. I think I wanted to actually take this opportunity to thank all our speakers at the moment, because I think each of them has brought some really nice insights throughout their presentations. And I would actively encourage you all out there to please post some questions for them. One of the ones I wanted to actually bring up with you is Rob, you covered this in your talk about obviously the expanding use of video, and obviously how important charisma is. I'm fairly sure from some of my clients we might have an issue there, but I'm sure we can get your advice on that. One of the things we wanted to check though is for video, as we're going into this, how do you find that balance between authenticity and polish?
Authenticity comes first all the time. You can have something that's completely unpolished and raw, and you can make that a net positive, really, because it might feel more authentic. It depends on the length of the content. Typically, you don't want to watch something that's very long form that doesn't have polish for it. And sometimes the polish is just disguise, really. It could be like jump cuts between a self-recorded thing, like a primitive kind of vlogger might use. If the person has charisma, if the message is compelling, then the message is more important than the medium. And it depends on the type of message you're trying to convey as well, because sometimes you are trying to sell sizzle itself, and generate kind of excitement, and you do need to portray something differently and with a fresh approach to really do that, just to blow the audience away with your intent almost. But no, I mean, I come from a documentary making background, so for me, authentic storytelling is the absolute key to creating films that will actually affect people's behavior or attitudes or mindset, and really that's the goal of most video communications. You're on mute, Matt.
I mean, it would not be a day without someone saying that to us at least once. So we've actually had a question from Paul in the audience, and he said that he's asked about your virtual saturation point, Nicole. Is it perhaps an opportunity for comms mechanisms such as customizable avatars, for example?
Sorry, I missed some of that. Could you just, is this an opportunity for?
Customizable avatars for virtual saturation in employee comms. Is this perhaps an opportunity for communications mechanisms such as customizable avatars, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything is an opportunity at the moment. I wouldn't rule anything out. I think if I was an organization, if I have to speak to that question, this is a really, really great opportunity for crowdsourcing ideas on what is going to work internally. And perhaps that's the answer. So I think everything needs to be seen as an opportunity at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. And something we've had another question on this, which I'll paraphrase, but it's essentially around that idea of us being at information overload. We're working longer hours, our social lives are blending with our work lives. You were saying how organizations were essentially going into overload and having to work harder to make us feel that identity and almost the feel of the company that they are working for us. Do you not feel though that by working harder and going into overload, they are essentially adding to that information overload?
I think the information overload usually comes from the organization as opposed to the work they're doing. So yes, information overload could come from the clients you're dealing with, but what we're hearing is it's more employers introducing so many new initiatives at the same time when we're all dealing with a number of different issues, and we can't actually absorb it all. There's too much going on. And our job at the moment is to focus on the work and, dealing with the day-to-day work. That's enough in itself. And then there's just too much coming in from, be it it's performance review time, be it, oh, we have a new strategy, be it, well, I'll stop there. But that's where information overload comes in. And I think organizations need to be really sensible about what they focus on and what the priorities are when employees are working in this way.
Great, thank you. And for you, Emma, I was wondering, with your time on working on that campaign and through your day-to-day work, and how have you seen that your engagement with journalists has changed over this time? Do you find that they're more available or less?
It's a bit of both, to be honest. It really depends about which sector you're kind of targeting. I've found that some journalists who are totally done with COVID, they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to listen about it, any sort of story that's related to it, they don't want to know, because I think that they probably have a little bit of information overload with it themselves, because obviously quite a lot of them were furloughed and had to pick up briefs from other people, so they were maybe running stories in different patches that they weren't necessarily used to. Others are absolutely delighted for a good news story. So we're in this really strange situation where there's almost too much news. There's a huge appetite for bad news or negative news that a client might not necessarily want. But then you find that, one of those really silly stories that a client might have once given us, where we're like, there's absolutely no way you're going to get that into a national newspaper. I mean, I'm talking like Shetland ponies with shoes on kind of story. Journalists are eating it up. So I think that it's really just, you have to find the angle, you have to look at the news agenda in that week, kind of on a day-to-day basis, really, and just decide, what is the gap here? What might this journalist not have seen before, and be a little bit creative. And it's actually, do you know what? It can be quite fun because it's not the same press releases that you're churning out on the daily basis as we used to.
Right, thank you. And I agree with Ishtar, who actually says, "Who doesn't love Shetland ponies with shoes on?" That is definitely a worthy news story. And just to build on that, I mean, during that time, obviously, of social distancing, have you found that interviews have been harder to schedule, or briefings? Because obviously a lot of it will now depend on online, and that essentially being on record.
No. So I think it's actually been easier. So what I found was that journalists are quite happy to have the off the record chat over the phone. And then it's actually much easier to link up a client to a journalist over a Zoom interview than it would be getting them all around the table in a room together and sorting out the lighting and the staging and all of that kind of thing. And when a journalist wants a story, they'll be quite happy to kind of move around the flexibility of the person who they're wanting to interview. And it's much easier to do it more quickly. So you can have that 15-minute time slot for an interview. Whereas before, that would maybe be a half day out of your day, your client's day, the journalist's day, to get to the venue, set everything up. So actually, I'm finding personally that we're finding it quite easy to get clients the kind of broadcast opportunities. Where it gets more tricky is when someone insists that it's in person, and you have to really find what the local restrictions are now, especially as things move into levels and tiers depending on which part of the country you're in. So yeah, that's the only kind of tricky part of it. But actually, I'm finding it a much easier process because everyone just has that spare 15 minutes to get on a Zoom interview.
Right. And Rob, on what you were saying about the amount of people who are now switching to doing video and pushing onto online, I mean, what would you say would be helpful to marking yourselves out, as there is an increased volume amount of video content? what should we be thinking about whenever trying to create something that's going to catch the eye?
Yeah, I mean, it's the first question. It's going to sound self-defeating. My first question is, does this need to be a video? You know, video has some real strengths, in that you can control reality and you can control storytelling and you can depict, you know, incredible things. You can depict very mundane and relatable things. But sometimes at the moment, I think people just need to read something or have a, you know, interact with a physical object or something, you know, instead. If so really it is that's why I put a little bit into the presentation about the importance of those fundamentals at the start of just defining what purpose does this film have? Can it really justify its place in somebody's daily schedule? And if so, like, brilliant, let's make something like fantastic that will really communicate, you know, clearly and stand out. And that's when all the different techniques come into play, and we can create something bespoke that, you know, to make sure we do that. But yeah, video doesn't have a right to exist and dominate our lives. Screens don't, you know, they shouldn't have that right to have that monopoly on our attention. So you just have to be very careful, and I'm aware of it as somebody, you know, for whom that's been my career. You know.
Great. And this is something I wanted to just double check with. I mean, you can't really have one of these sessions about, you know, best practice where they're asking who's doing it well and who's doing an absolute shocking job. Oh, sorry, Nicole, do you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll be a little facetious and say it's very difficult to call out one organization that's doing all this well or shame an organization that's not. I don't think anyone can hold their hand up and say, I'm doing this brilliantly. But I think there are organizations that have managed to, certainly from a employee communications perspective, have managed to shift really quickly and adapt. And I call out one client that I work with, global pharmaceutical company, 100,000 employees. And when COVID reared its head, you know, back in March, there was so much in this reactive crisis management mode. But what they did quite quickly is switch to proactive communications, so that when it came, and Emma talked a little bit about this in her presentation, they were ahead of the curve. So then when it came to return to work, which they had for a bit, and now we've gone back down into lockdown in different markets at different stages, they kind of know the drill. And they're ahead of it. They've pre-prepared stuff and they're very proactive. And that now, it doesn't feel like a crisis and it doesn't feel like a panic. I think the organizations that haven't done it so well, I feel very much they're still in this reactive crisis role. So now where we are now, say in the UK, we've just gone back down into lockdown. It's been panic communications again. And it actually, if they'd have got it right, this would just be drumbeat now. This would be normal. So I would say it's hard to call out anyone that's doing it really well, but taking that process from reactive to proactive would be my best advice.
Great, thank you. And Rob?
Yeah, I think especially in kind of the healthcare and pharmaceutical space, the one company that I've really respected more off the back of the commission that they made is AstraZeneca, and we've worked a lot with them going back like 10 plus years. But they wanted to create a campaign that promoted the childhood flu vaccination program with the support of the government. It wasn't something they were going to make any money off of, but they felt that it was their place to try and get the message out there in a kind of interesting way. And they took risks with that, and it was with their PR agency to actually make the film. But their idea was using MPs, showing that MPs may disagree on virtually everything you can imagine, mundane or serious, but the one thing that they can all agree on, and there's a consensus around, is the importance of getting your child vaccinated this winter to help protect the child, the vulnerable, and the NHS. And so we shipped USB mics. We couldn't film in person with the MPs, that's what we've normally done, of course, but we did record it over Zoom, but we gave them all mics and cameras so we could have consistency and a degree of quality. And then we interviewed them kind of face to face. They were all really up for it. We made it really fun and funny, despite it being such a serious, kind of a serious subject, so that it would earn its place, in the mix. It would hook viewers in and retain them to the end, using humour and showing MPs in the kind of unexpected light, but then with a weighty message at the end of it. It was a risk they didn't have to take, but they're going to get. It's not launched yet, but they're going to get a really effective piece of comms off the back of it. So, kudos to them for that, I think.
Fantastic. And Emma, I suppose it's a little harder for you to really say about who's doing it well, because obviously if it's crisis comms, they're not going to be in the news. However,
Exactly.
But is there anyone else that's kind of marked out as you think has maybe been too reactive or not handling their messaging well?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to name any or specific organisations other than I don't know what is going on with how the UK government is announcing some of their things. They're doing a lot of things really well, but I'm going to go back to, I think, that point where I talked about comms first and then action second. You have to get the comms right before you make an announcement. And I'm thinking very recently of the furlough announcement, the 80% furlough in England when England needs it. And then the devolved administration's all knocking at the door and saying, hello, what about us? But they hadn't thought about it. And it was not a nasty thing of, we don't want these countries to have money. It was a simple they had to make an announcement quickly, but they hadn't got the comms right before they made the announcement. And it's really, really important. Comms cannot be a last resort because it creates confusion and it creates mistrust when you get it wrong. So yeah, I'm going to call them out.
Well, with an audience of comms professionals, I think we all agree with you there. We actually have another question in the chat from Agatha, who said that obviously you've spoken about crisis comms as part of your presentation on media relations. She wants to know what the role of social media was in your campaign.
Yeah, so social media is tricky because a lot of the time with a crisis, depending on, so if you're on Twitter or Facebook, depending on the amount of followers that the person who might be calling you out has, you might advise that you don't respond, or you might advise that you take it offline and you respond kind of privately, so it's the whole argument's not playing out on social media. But what we found is that in this kind of crisis, when there's such massive public interest in what's going on, you kind of have to be visible. And that is a matter of being super empathetic on social media. I think signing your name on social media is often really important. It's something that some organizations do really well and some miss. You have to put a personality behind that social media account when you're coming from an organization or a corporate, because people don't tend to understand it. But yeah, like, social media is tricky and it really just depends on the situation. Within this crisis management situation, we found that replying almost instantly to something that came up was just the best tactic, and apologizing when you get it wrong on social media as well. You don't apologize, you suddenly got 100 retweets and it all goes very wrong.
Great. Yeah, and someone's actually just commented that ScotRail are great at personalizing the responses. In fact, you see on a lot of training companies doing it now, yeah. Great. I think we've actually come to the rest of our questions and also wrapping up the end of this session. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you all very much for your presentations, and thank you to everyone who joined us today, and particularly those who provided us with some questions. This is probably going to be the last event of our healthcare event this year, but we should have a cracking good program next year. So please look on the PRCA website for that. Thank you all again for joining, and a special thank you out to our sponsors, Vulio, as well.